Lorwyn, Chapter 12. All at once the sky was filled with deadly poison-tipped arrows, every one of them on a trajectory that would end with Rhys, his companions, or one of the giants. Aisling, one hand still engulfed in the flame, did the only thing she could do. Rather than release the elemental fire as a weapon directed against the giants, she whirled in place and sent as much energy she dared into a wide sheet of burning plasma that ignited the very air over the heads of her companions. Or rather, most of her companions. The plasma sheet incinerated the arrows headed towards the elf, the fairies, the Kifkin, and Aisling herself, but there was nothing she could do about the projectiles headed for the giants. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Brian shield Marilyn with one hand just before the barrage struck home. Dozens of arrows tipped with potent moonglove poison punctured their thick hides. Within seconds, the poison's effect was visible and audible. Brian roared as the pain of the venom coursed into his veins, and soon Kiel joined in the chorus of deafening agony. Brian was the first to stumble when he tried to take a step towards the source of the arrows and caught his foot on the remains of a rotten tree trunk. Rhys, Aisling, and Brigid barely escaped being crushed by several hundred tons of toppling giant. Rhys shouted a warning and then scooped up the archer and charged out of the impact zone. Aisling was already moving. She didn't have the strength for another display like the sheet of plasma, and wouldn't have for hours. They had to be out of the target area before the next volley of arrows came flying from the woods. Brian's face-first collision with the ground shook the earth and knocked the flamekin off her feet. She flew sprawling to the ground as she heard the chorus of whooshing sounds marking the imminent arrival of another volley. She may not have had the energy to shield them all, but Aisling could at least protect herself and survive to help the others. As projectiles landed all around her, she concentrated on the living flame that wreathed her body, willing it to burn with the heat of 1,000 suns, drawing on reserves she'd never had to tap into before. A rush of heat and light enveloped her, and she boldly stood to face the attack. The blazing flamekin strode purposefully towards the fallen giant's hand, resting slightly open, and every arrow that came within 2 feet of Aisling was reduced to ash. Marilyn was not moving and appeared unconscious or even dead, but the shelter of Brian's curled fingers shielded her from the second rain of death. The giant definitely was unconscious, and from what Aisling had heard of Moonglove, he would be lucky to ever wake up. Another thunderous crash shook the ground, but this time Aisling managed to keep her feet. She could not see Rhys or the Kifkin, so she could not tell what effect Kiel's collapse had wrought on them. But as the giant fell first to his knees and then onto his side with an anguished groan, Marilyn was shaken loose from Brian's palm and slid onto the ground like a rag doll. You could run, Aisling told herself. Save yourself. They can't touch you. The path does not have to end here. But was this a path that she really wanted to walk? A selfish path? No, she decided. And then, to bolster her convictions, the Flamekin said aloud, It is not the end, but I think it's going to be a substantial fork in the road. Keeping her flame as hot as she could, she finally reached Marilyn, and just in time. The third volley was slightly more ragged than the second, which told Aisling the elves were beginning to split off and close in, but she was able to place herself between the Mornsong Traveller and the attackers to incinerate the third volley, though Marilyn would probably require some burn ointment when she woke up. The third round of arrows would most likely be the last, and soon the hunters would close in for the kill. Aisling had spent much of her time on the path avoiding encounters with elves. Her people and theirs had never been allies, and these days they were at best mildly antagonistic neighbors who stayed out of each other's business. But the Flamekin had been witness to elf attacks before. When a pilgrim wandered Lorwyn long enough, it was bound to happen, and more than once. The new Dane, whoever he was, seemed to be sticking with the traditional tactics. Aisling grimaced as the third volley of arrows petered out. Rhys and the Kifkin could be dead. The fairies could look after themselves, and there was nothing she could do for the giants. Perhaps the brothers' sighs would save them, but it also meant that there was no way a Flamekin and the unconscious stranger could do anything for them. With a thought, she pulled the heat of the living flames back within her stony flesh and cooled herself enough to sling Marilyn over one shoulder, without causing the stranger any additional injury. Before she turned to flee, Aisling spared a glance over one shoulder at the forces in pursuit. The fact that she could see them at all was a sign the attackers were fairly certain they'd already won. Like most pack predators, elves showed their true numbers only when the kill was assured. The Dane, adorned with gleaming silver pauldrons of high rank, stood at the edge of the tree line, a silver sword flashing in the first rays of the dawn held high over his noble head. "Vinebread, march!" the elf ordered, dropping his sword and pointing the tip directly at Aisling. On his command, what had appeared to be wild undergrowth moved. Aisling had seen elves in combat before, but her experience with the Vinebread amounted to a few distant battlefields sighted from the hilltops of Tanscarpa, where the elves had employed them against the savage boggart tribes of that forsaken place. She had heard about them, of course. The elves considered them living works of functional art. They were slaves, they were protectors, and above all they served as shock troops. But beautiful as they were, at the heart they were prisoners in a living hell Aisling could not even imagine. The threat to those who opposed the elves that risked them becoming Vinebread was one of the reasons, perhaps the main reason, that the elves ruled most of Lorwyn. "Hello, Flameface," a lilting voice said, and Aisling saw sparkling lights. She looked up to see one of the fairies hovering overhead. Ileana, she guessed, but it was hard to say without the other two present to compare. The fairy's tiny face wore a mask of extreme irritation. "Do you suppose blood vines can get their roots into one of your kind? I can see from here you've got plenty of blood." "Not mine," Aisling said. "It's Brian's." "Tragic, I'm sure," the fairy replied. "Now follow me if you want to live. And I want you to know that the only reason I'm doing this is because Rhys asked me to." "I don't doubt it for a second," Aisling said, shifting her burden slightly for the run ahead of her. The elves' hand-grown shock troops did not move quickly, but they would pick up speed over the open meadowland, and wouldn't lose much of it in the scattered trees that lined the road. Still, with any luck, Aisling could make it to the deep forest she had seen on the walk into Kinsbale. Even if they were mostly plants themselves, the lumbering Vinebread wouldn't be agile, she hoped, as she could be. And if the worst came to worst, Aisling still wasn't completely powerless. Surely she had more reserves somewhere. "Was there something about come with me that was unclear?" Aisling resisted the urge to swat at the ferry. "Lead the way." Now the trick was to get where the Vinebread couldn't reach them, and the elves wouldn't find it much easier. "The forest," Aisling called after Ileana as the ferry led her into the sparse stands of alder. "We have got to get to the deep forest." "No, we've got to get to Rhys," the fairy said. "He and the Kifkin are waiting at the river." "Of course," Aisling said. "I stand corrected." "I wouldn't be standing around at all, corrected or otherwise," the fairy called back. "Good way to get yourself dead." Sygg paused a moment in his pacing to take another long look down the road that, just around the bend and a few miles through the woods, ended at the Kinsbale dock. The finest Kifkin landscapers had carefully manicured the road. Its cobblestone surface was swept and polished up to the point where it became packed earth, and the packed earth was swept smooth for half a mile beyond the town gate. Persistent potholes had been filled in, and someone had planted 2 new rows of dazzling deep green topiaries that Teague thought were a fitting and noble honor guard for the town's most distinguished visitor, the Treefer Colfanor. Behind him, the entire town was abuzz with anticipation for the day's tales. The entire population of Kinsbale had turned out in their finest attire. Of course, and with the many visitors from the surrounding villages, a huge crowd had assembled by dawn. Most milled around in the town square, speaking with Colfanor, who amiably held conversations with several people at once. Others bought sweetmeats and crab-apple pies, tried their luck with the games of chance that always seemed to spring up at any large Kifkin gathering, or joined in on one of the many rousing renditions of The Hero of Kinsbale that always seemed to spontaneously arise whenever Kifkin came together in this town. Overhead, hundreds of fairies filled the air, their wings lending an ever-present hum to the bustle of activity. The fairies didn't buy sweetmeats or attempt to hurl pine cones at stacks of ale bottles for money, but they did light up the dawn sky with hundreds of twinkling lights that lent the entire town the appearance of an enchanted village from the oldest tales. Stories with origins in Lorwyn's deep, distant past. So much was going right, but there was trouble in the air. Loud trouble. The trouble had driven Teague to pace back and forth in front of the open town gate for the last 15 minutes. He nodded and smiled to the occasional passer-by, but most gave him a wide berth, and he cursed himself for being unable to mask his concern that this day could be in jeopardy. To his dismay, those hundreds of Kifkin and hundreds of fairies gathered to hear the tales that Colfanor would spin were also engaged in agitated, nervous conversation about the terrible sounds they had heard for the last half-hour. Teague had dispatched a few scouts to report on what sounded like a giant trying to uproot the entire forest, but they had not returned. Whatever the giants were doing, they didn't seem to be getting any closer, and sometimes giants just made noise. It was a fact of life, but there was too much at stake, far too much pre-festival organization that stood to collapse in ruins, and Teague forced himself to consider sending out the city's armed militia to restore order in the forest. Teague's nerves were shot, so it was understandable, he would tell himself later, for him to scream like a Kifling girl when a nearby piece of shrubbery he'd assumed was a new decorative addition pulled its roots from the ground and stepped into the street. After the initial outburst, Teague was able to keep his mouth shut and wished he could do the same with his eyes, especially when another 10, no 20. By the bubbling bog, every one of the new topiaries was moving. They were glorious, and they were frightening. The vinebread stepped slowly but precisely into a formation, three abreast, that filled the street and blocked any hope of making out what was happening with those distant giants. Teague had not seen the vinebread in action, but there was no mistaking what the new arrivals were. They had been the same rough shapes as the creatures they once had been. Now that they were in motion, it was easier to spot the host body within the tendrils' moss and flexible wooden musculature. The three in front were once elves, eye-blights no doubt. The one on the left displayed 2 dark patches of bare bone, long since stained green with moss on its forehead, where its horns ought to have been. The other 2 had similar injuries. All 3 were covered with a mass of green vines. Teague blamed the vines' deep emerald coloration for the fact he'd failed to notice a small army of deadly, remorseless, beautiful killing machines taking up position on the main road into his town. He intended to make that fact quite clear at the next meeting of the town elders. Should such a meeting take place, and should the town still have any elders at the end of this day. When the vinebread appeared, living things died, or they became vinebread, he would say. Yes, good citizens, that is true. And no one else noticed that they were on our doorstep. Let them talk their way out of that one. Other than that clever dodge of responsibility, Sen Teague had no idea what to do. Where were the elves? There were sure to be elves somewhere controlling these things. Surely they couldn't have wandered into town on their own. He wondered at the wisdom of allowing the outlaw Reese to visit Colfanor here. Perhaps it had been a mistake to invite the Red Ewe after all. Sen, said the young Kifkin clerk, who chose that moment to appear, sparing him the need to find a course of action. Gavin clutched a scroll in one hand. This floor plan is completely unworkable, Sen. There must have been some miscalculations early on. It appears someone mistakenly annotated the sketch with inches instead of... Fine bread, Sen? They are... Silence, Teague said, grateful for the opportunity to show his boundless courage by denigrating that of his inferior. Guess of course they're vine bread, Mr. Gavin. Just noticed, did you? He meant the words to sound friendly and light, but they came out filled with recrimination. Now, Sentig, the creature cannot have been expected to notice them any more than you did, came a commanding voice from somewhere just off the road ahead, and to Teague's right. No, above the road? That was a shadow in the boughs of the Kinwood copse. Yes, it clearly was, and as Teague stared at the shadow, it took on the shape of a tall, noble elf in the golden attire of a Tersen. As Teague understood it, the highest rank a hunter could hope to achieve without becoming perfect. Worse, the Sen recognized this particular Tersen. Nath? Teague said aloud. Nath? The confused and terrified clerk stammered. Even the green bureaucrat knew the name. What does he want? The next words the Gilt-Leaf Tersen spoke were not directed at the Sen. Chevor, Nath said in an almost conversational tone that still somehow carried all the authority a voice could contain. Establish your perimeter. Yes, Ter, came another voice, a younger female voice, also from the trees, but the voice's owner didn't stay there for long. With the hum of dozens of leather gloves sliding along dozens of hangman's vines, the vanguard of the Gilt-Leaf pack entered Kinsbale. They seemed to drop from every direction, upsetting small flocks of fairies forced to dodge their descent. Meanwhile, at a gesture from Nath, the vine-bread marched into position. Kifkin of Kinsbale, Nath said as he strolled through the crowd, flanked by a pair of honor guards. The Kifkin obediently parted ways to make room. For those of you who are unaware, I am Tersen Nath, Supreme Huntmaster of the Gilt-Leaf Nation. You Kifkin are here at our discretion, but we mean you no harm. You will be allowed to go about your business so long as it does not interfere with mine. You may listen to your tales and share your stories, but know this. Your town has the honor of being the headquarters from which I shall strike down the enemies of the blessed nation. Teague felt his feet moving to intercept the Tersen before he even realized he was moving. Well, in for a farthing. Honored Tersen, the Sen said, and he genuflected before the elf. You are welcome as always. The blessed cast their blessings upon the Kifkin brothers and sisters. This time of tales is for all to share. Yes, Nath said, without bothering to look at Teague. I'm sure it is. The red ewe that filled most of the greensward in the town square occupied the Tersen's attention. Colfanor had said nothing since the elves and their vine-bred servants had appeared. But then the tree folk supposedly had a very different kind of relationship with the elves than the Kifkin did. Teague could not even be certain that Nath wasn't here at Colfanor's request. Though the ewe had shared many secrets with the Sen of late, he could certainly be keeping more within his noble bounds. Colfanor's first words with the Tersen did little to assuage Teague's suspicions, but neither did they confirm any complicity on the treefolk's part. Now, the treefolk said, you have come to hear the tales? It was not a question. Among other things, Sage Colfanor, the Tersen replied. Among other things. What other things do you have? Sygg asked. What other things do you have? Sygg asked. Because if this is all you have to offer, you're wasting my time. I lost an apprentice recently, and one doesn't lure new apprentices when one is unsuccessful. But that is everything that I earned from the Sen, Aisling protested. We don't have any more thread. She looked sideways at Rhys, carrying the still unconscious Marilyn over one shoulder, and Bridget. Do we? The elf shrugged and shook his head. The Kifkin was engaged in an intensive study of the toe of her boot. Captain, you just ferried me across the river, and still owe me 2 passages from that journey. I sympathize with your loss, as unexpected as it was tragic, Aisling said, trying to keep the exasperation out of her voice. The elves would be on them at any minute. The giants could not keep them occupied forever. She was surprised, in fact, that it was taking so long. The giants had hit the ground before they made their hasty retreat to the river. Whatever they were doing to those giants, she didn't want to think about it. She was already racked with guilt over leaving them behind, and she barely knew them. Brian and Keel had fallen without a fight, and that had rankled at Aisling. You're not telling me anything I don't know, Pilgrim, the mirror said groggily. He had been sleeping when they'd arrived at the dock, floating in slumber and tethered to the dock by a slender vine rope. It was the usual way for Merrow ferrymen to rest, for it meant they never had to be far away from the docks that provided their livelihood. True, some slept in crannocks, but Sygg was clearly a traditionalist. And I never said when you could collect. This coil of gold is 100 times what I paid you for that ride, Aisling protested. Now I can promise you more, but I can't tell you when you'll get it, or how much you'll get. But we have got to get out of here. You hear those footsteps? Those are Vinebread. Yeah, Fishface, Endry said. Big Vinebread. They're going to turn you into walking kelp, Visa added. You know, Mr. Big Elf, Ileana said to Rhys. We could always carry you all, for a few minutes at least. Before Rhys could reply, Aisling said, Nobody is carrying anyone. Captain, forgive them. They're fairies, Sygg said. That's besides the point. You woke me up from me nap, and I have no first mate, and you of all people should know that. And you want me to ferry you where? The Bosque? And all the while under fire from bog knows what, into waters I haven't navigated in 30 years. And you want me to bring a suspicious-looking elf, no offence Tare, and a shifty Kifkin, and these buzzing, nattering fairies, to say nothing of the unconscious lady there. Flamkin, you're lucky I haven't doused you for making me such an insulting offer. Aisling cast about in frustration, looking for something, anything she could offer the Merrow captain, when her eyes fell upon a flash of gold at Rhys's belt. Without a word, she marched to his side and pulled free the coil of thread, the thread meant for the giant brothers. The flamekin ran a thumb over the frayed end of the coil. I can double the offer, she said. Flamekin, you shouldn't. If the giants live, Elf, I'll pay them back out of my own pocket, Aisling said. Now, Captain Sygg, is this going to get you to see reason or... Strike! For the 4th time that day, Aisling heard the telltale sound of hundreds of poison arrows flying their way. Their time was up. She glanced up and saw a cloud of tiny black lines arcing upwards against the pink dawn sky. In another second they would begin their descent. She glanced at the road. Where that other hunter? Rhys had called him Griffith, and he was clearly the Dane of his pack, stood flanked by lieutenants with drawn silver blades. There were no Vinebread in sight as of yet. This new Dane had realized at last that the creature's plodding steps would only give the pack away. He had approached in stealth, and had probably been waiting to open fire until all of his hunters were in position. It was a common elf tactic, the sudden, precise, and decisive ambush. Sygg reacted with alarming speed for someone who had been in a deep state of unconsciousness only minutes before. You've got a deal! He raised his arms and with supreme effort summoned a simple concave disc of shapewater, not bothering to add the usual flourishes. This ferry was functional, and that was it. Without breaking his focus, the ferryman shouted, "Get aboard, everyone! All aboard now!" The small party made it onto the shapewater ferry just as the torrent of deadly silver rained down uselessly upon the dock. But the rest of Griffith's hunters were already charging, blades in hand. Aisling felt the chill soaking into her boots and willed flame into her skin to keep her dry. It would work for a while, but once they were away, she'd need to figure out something better. "You want to take the long way round or the short way, Flamekin?" the captain barked. "What?" Aisling said. "But I don't know anything about—" "Short way it is," Sygg called, bobbing slightly in the water to avoid an arrow that slipped silently into the current. "Make sure everyone's secure. I don't have time to worry about people falling off." "Yes," Aisling said. Aye." As the Marrow dropped back into the water, his long, powerful tail kicked furiously. Sygg thrust his splayed, webbed hands into the air. He called out a few bubbling, unpronounceable words of an ancient Marrow tongue, and moments later a soft blue glow formed around the shapewater saucer. The glow spread, became cohesive like a sheet of blue water, until it formed a thin bubble of energy. With a jolt that almost knocked Aisling onto her flaming charcoal posterior, Captain Sygg set off. He and his passengers safe, Aisling hoped, within the bubble.